Hello, everybody. It's time to look at the lesson for this Sunday, and I really hope that these videos, I know a lot of you have commented that they're helping you. I hope they're not just being listened to, and so, that's interesting. I hope you're putting these things as much as you can into your lesson, because a lot of times lessons covering a portion of Scripture, like today, that's got so much in it, but the lesson can only do so much, and sometimes it doesn't give you some specifics that I think would be helpful, and I think this is definitely one of those times. So I want to just encourage you to try to do what you can to put these things into your lesson. And I want to start off with the context section. Context is very important, but sometimes they give you stuff in the context section that isn't really pertinent to your lesson enough to worry about. You don't want to spend time this week, I don't think, talking about Genesis 4 and the different lines that they talk about, lineages and stuff in the first couple paragraphs. What you really want to focus on is chapter 10 as far as context, and I want to show you why. I'm going to give you a lot of specifics that aren't in the curriculum, because the curriculum, first of all, makes this statement in that section: most likely the Tower of Babel narrative in chapter 11 took place within the time span of these generations, and they're speaking of chapter 10, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, I'm not sure why they say most likely, because chapter 10, verse 25 clearly states that during the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. So that's when the Tower of Babel happened. So I don't think there's any ambiguity there, or there shouldn't be. So the question is, well, how much time has passed since Noah and his sons walked out of the ark, and when this event occurs in Genesis chapter 11? Well, we can't be exact on this, but if the genealogy is right there, if you just trace it, not in chapter 10. In chapter 10, it doesn't give you their ages and their lifespans, but it does trace the line of Shem specifically that way at the second half of chapter 11. So, for example, Arpachshad, chapter 11 now, Genesis chapter 11, verse 10. Arpachshad, which is one of the sons of Shem, was born 2 years after the flood. So keep track of these years that I'm going to spout at you here. 2 years after the flood. In verse 12, Arpachshad until the birth of Shelah was 35 years. Verse 14, from Shelah to the birth of Eber is 30 years. And then verse 16, from Eber to Peleg is 34 years. Now, chapter 10, verse 25 says basically sometime during the life of Peleg, the earth was divided. So Peleg lived to be 239 years old. So assuming that the Tower of Babel scenario happened towards the end of his life, because that gives you as much time as possible for the earth to be populated to the amount that it would have to be to have this kind of scenario take place in Genesis 11. I'm going to take those years, 2 years, 35 years, and 30 years, and 34 years, and then I'm going to add at least about 200 years to that, because Peleg lived to be 239 years old. And you're going to come up with close to 300 years that between the time that Noah came off the ark and the Tower of Babel takes place. Again, I say that because in order for the scattering of these people to be able to go out and eventually create these nations of the earth that fill the earth, you've got to have time for there to be a population significant to do that. The other thing about we need to understand about chapter 10 and chapter 11 is that chapter 10 gives you the different families that come from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it talks about them having their own language and all that, and then you get to chapter 11 and everyone's speaking the same language. So what you have to understand with Genesis is that sometimes we saw it in the creation account. You'll have the creation of man in chapter 1, and chapter 2 kind of almost is like a parenthesis giving you details about that. That's what we have in chapter 10 and 11. Chapter 11, chronologically, takes place before these people are described as going out and living here and there and speaking this language and whatever language. But chapter 10 is kind of giving you these families, and then chapter 11 is showing you how they went from being all in one place to going to these different locations where they ended up living and creating a people from their descendants. So I hope that's clear in how I just explained it. And Genesis 11 is a perfect illustration of Proverbs 10:24. Proverbs 10:24, the first part of the verse says, "The fear of the wicked, it shall come upon him." So in Genesis, we see these people who didn't want to be scattered. Verse 4 says they did not want to be scattered, and yet that's exactly what God does to them because of their rebellion, because of their wickedness. They were refusing to do what God had told them to do. God told them to go out and fill the earth in chapter 9, verse 1. And yet verse 2 of chapter 11, not only were they just staying together in one place. You know, when I was young, I used to think of this as just, well, they got off the ark and they just hung out all in the same place. But that's not what they did. They got off the ark and they were so committed to being always together that they migrated together from the mountains of Ararat to the area of Shinar, which is the Fertile Crescent, which becomes the area of Babylon. The Babylonian area. So it wasn't just like they just stayed in one place and never left. They actually very purposefully stayed together as they moved from where they first were when they came off the ark to the Fertile Crescent area. Now, the curriculum says that we often see in Genesis people moving east. It gives a bunch of examples. And here it talks about in Genesis 11, they went east from Mount Ararat, and they make this assumption from that, or conclusion, which is an assumption, that moving east in the book of Genesis illustrates separation. Well, see, this is the kind of symbolism stuff that I do not do, and I urge you not to do. There's no evidence in Scripture that that's true. There's nowhere in Scripture where you'll see any kind of remote implication that moving eastward symbolizes separation. Now, maybe it does, but I'm not going to teach that because I don't see it, and I think it's just not wise to make those leaps. What is clear is what motivated them to stay together and to want to build this structure we usually call the Tower of Babel. They're motivated by their humanistic, arrogant, proud rebellion. Verse 4 says they wanted to make for themselves a name. They wanted to show that, kind of like today, where man thinks he's everything. Man's going to save the planet, right? Everything hinges on man. It also certainly was a false worship entity to it. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But they were rebelling against God's clear command, as I've already said, to fill the earth. To be fruitful and fill the earth. And the implication isn't just fill the earth in one spot. To fill it, you've got to move. You've got to go to various locations. Interestingly enough, later writings from ancient Babylon boasted that their city was impregnable and that it was the heavenly city. The ancient Babylonians called their city Babalu, which means the gateway of God. And I grew up, in the 70s, and so I couldn't help but think of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven song. Yes, I used to listen to pretty hardcore rock music till the Lord convicted me of it. But they were building a stairway to heaven in their mind. And they're really called in Revelation chapter 17, speaking of the tribulation period, the one world religion is called Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots. And I believe, and commentators believe, that the reason why John gives that description of them in Revelation 17 is because I think it was Tim LaHaye that said all false religions can be traced back to Babylon, can be traced back to the Tower of Babel. That is really what was going on here, was a false worship of themselves, or maybe of some gods of their invention. The tower itself is thought to be an early version of a ziggurat, ancient Babylon, which of course becomes this great city of Babylon. Ancient Babylon is known to have had many of these that were built later, And one of their most famous ones was called Iti Mananki. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, which literally means to link heaven and earth. And so this was their, part of their false worship, that they're gonna get to heaven their way, just like what people think today. In verse 6, the Lord, in chapter 11, verse 6, it says, "Behold, they are one people," this is the Lord speaking, "and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them." God is obviously not saying that they're going to be able to get to heaven or that they could do anything they want, but I think he's focusing on their wickedness, their rebellion. If they're going to do this, what is the extent of their unbelief and their rebellion? And so, because he's not going to destroy the earth again, he really, in grace, brings this judgment that allows them to live and to do what he commanded them to do, which was to spread out and fill the earth. Very interesting parallel to the early church. Jesus commanded his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel. But after Pentecost, they didn't do that immediately. You go all the way to Acts chapter 8, and they're still in Jerusalem primarily. And in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, it's not until Saul starts ravaging the church, persecution is happening, that kind of forces them to do what God commanded them to do. So Saul was consenting unto his death, Acts 8:1. And at that time, there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they're all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. In Acts chapter 8, verse 4, 3 verses later says, "Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere, preaching the word." In Acts 1:8, they were told to go into Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And that's exactly where they're scattered to in Acts chapter 8, verse 1. Interesting parallel. They didn't really obey right away, and so God has to bring almost a certain kind of judgment. In Acts, it's through persecution to get them to obey. And I think that's the real lesson in this passage, is that when we refuse to do God's will, he's still going to accomplish his will. Your disobedience isn't going to keep him from accomplishing his will. However, your disobedience will either result in him using someone else, or in the case here of Genesis chapter 11, his will is going to be accomplished at your expense. He's going to have to make the situation unpleasant for you, instead of the joy and the pleasantness it would have been if they obeyed and did things God's way. We see that same kind of thing happening with Jonah. God's will was still done, but Jonah had to go through a horrifying experience and also bring some bad consequences on those sailors that were with him in the boat until they threw him overboard. Esther, same principle. When Mordecai approaches Esther and tells her, "You've got to go to the king, you got to go to your husband and tell him, what Haman is doing," and so forth, and she's afraid to do it at first. And Mordecai says this, "Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, 'Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place.'" In other words, God's will is going to be done. "But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." So, I hope those things will help you. I think they give a little more meat to the lesson. And I hope that you'll be able to incorporate those and have a great class.